Good morning everyone. So today we are going to discuss about electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. Okay, so if you recall, this is the structure. This is a mitochondria, all right, and this is the outer membrane, and this is the inner membrane. And then you can see there are many infolding of the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and this inner folding of the inner membrane of the mitochondria is known as the cristae. All right, now so electron transport chain, okay, is a collection of molecules embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. So senang cerita, this is one set of an electron transport chain. Okay, so dalam inner membrane mitochondria ni kan ada banyak electron transport chain. Now, this electron transport chain, okay, as I mentioned earlier, is located in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And then the folding of the inner mitochondrial membrane increases its surface, providing space for thousands of copies of the electron transport chain in each mitochondrion. Now, this electron transport chain consists of, okay, so a closer look of this electron transport chain, okay, consists of complex 1. Ini ialah complex 1, okay, nampak ah? Okay, and this complex 1 is known as the NADH dehydrogenase or NADH ubiquinone oxidoreductase. Then we have, after complex 1, we have this structure here, which is the ubiquinone Q, okay, or also known as coenzyme Q or COQ. Okay, so this ubiquinone is a small hydrophobic molecule, and apparently this ubiquinone is the only member of the electron transport chain that is not protein. So dalam electron transport chain ini, okay, kompleks 1, 2, 3, 4 dengan cytochrome C ini semuanya protein kecuali ubiquinone. And then we have complex 2, okay, nampak ah complex 2 ini? This is the succinate ubiquinone reductase. Then we have complex 3, okay, complex 3, which is the cytochrome BC1 complex, okay, ataupun this complex 3 also known as ubiquinone cytochrome C oxidoreductase. Then we have cytochrome C. After cytochrome C, we have complex 4, okay, which is also known as the cytochrome C oxidase complex. Now, complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4, okay, act as proton pump, that pumping proton from the matrix of the mitochondria to the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. So you can see from this picture here, this complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4 are pumping hydrogen ions from the matrix of the mitochondria into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. Now, each of these complex 1, okay, complex 2, complex 3, and complex 4, they are tightly bound with prosthetic group. Okay, and this example of these prosthetic groups, they are the flavin nucleotides, quinones, iron sulfur clusters, heme, and copper ion. Okay, we go to that part later into more detail. So now, before I proceed in the next slide, okay, students, you must know this is complex 1, complex 2, okay, and then we have ubiquinone, then we have complex 3, cytochrome C, and complex 4. And always remember, only complex 1, 3, and 4 pump hydrogen ions or proton from the matrix of the mitochondria into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. Now, in the electron transport chain, alright, a series of sequential redox reaction take place along the electron transport chain. Okay, maksudnya ialah complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, as well as ubiquinone and cytochrome C, they are reduced when this complex 1, 2, 3, 4 ubiquinon and cytochrome C receive electrons from its uphill neighbor. Okay, contohnya ubiquinon ni bila dia terima elektron daripada dia punya uphill neighbor iaitu kompleks 1, ubiquinon ni akan oxidize. Ubiquinon ni akan reduce. Then bila ubiquinon ni pass elektron tu kepada kompleks 3, what happen? Ubiquinon ni akan kembali oxidize. Dan kompleks 3 ni pula bila dia terima elektron daripada ubiquinon, kompleks 3 ni akan reduce. Okay, so let's go back here. These complexes as well as the ubiquinon and cytochrome C, they are reduced when they receive electron from its uphill neighbor, which has a low affinity for electrons, and oxidize when it releases the electrons to the next complex or its downhill neighbor. So kalau kita ambil contoh kompleks 1 dengan ubiquinon, kompleks 1 ini ialah uphill neighbor untuk ubiquinon, dan ubiquinon ni ialah downhill neighbor untuk kompleks 1. Okay, so between complex 1 and ubiquinon, complex 1 is has low affinity for electron. That's why complex 1 donates the electron to the ubiquinon, right? And between ubiquinon and complex 3, ubiquinon has lower affinity for electrons. That's why ubiquinon donates the electrons to the complex 3. Okay, so before we proceed, I hope you understand the concept of uphill and downhill neighbor, right? Now, what happens in the electron transport chain? So we have a different uptake of the earlier diagram of the electron transport chain. So ini lebih kurang sama lah, cuma ini diagram ni lebih detail sikit, right? Because it tells you what are the prostatic group inside each complexes. Okay, so first NADH, right, transfers electrons and protons to the complex 1, right? So after NADH transfer these electrons and proton to complex 1, the NADH becomes NAD plus. Okay, the NADH is reduced to NAD plus. Okay, now this complex 1, right, is a flavoprotein. Okay, because this complex 1 has prostatic group that is called the flavin mononucleotide, FMN. Remember earlier I said complex 1, complex 2, complex 3, complex 4 and cytochrome C oxidase, they are all protein except ubiquinon. Okay, so complex 1 is a flavoprotein because of the presence of the flavin mononucleotide. Next, complex 1. Okay, after complex 1 receive the proton from the NADH, the complex 1 pumps the proton into the intermembrane space of mitochondria. Okay, they pump. Then next, complex 1 is reduced and then oxidized when complex 1 transfer the electrons to an iron sulfur protein, okay, in the complex 1. Now the iron sulfur protein reduced when receive the electrons, okay, from the FMN, and then this ferrum sulfur, okay, ferrum sulfur protein oxidized when this ferrum sulfur protein passes the electrons to the ubiquinon, or simply another different view of explanation, complex 1, okay, is reduced when complex 1 receive electrons from the NADH. Then complex 1 is oxidized when complex 1 passes the electrons to the ubiquinon. Ubiquinon is reduced when ubiquinon receive the electrons, okay, from the complex 1. Then ubiquinone becomes oxidized when ubiquinone passes the electrons to the cytochrome B in the complex 3. Okay, student, ubiquinone bukan pass elektron ke kompleks 2. Ubiquinone pass elektron yang dia receive daripada kompleks 1 kepada kompleks 3, ataupun to be more specific, cytochrome B di dalam kompleks 3. Okay, so kompleks B ini, alright, kompleks B, kompleks 3 ini, okay, ada cytochrome B, and this cytochrome B has heme group with iron that accept and donates the electrons. So kenapa cytochrome B ini di dalam kompleks 3 boleh terima elektron? It is because this cytochrome B has heme group with iron that can accept and donates electrons. Next, FADH2, right, passes proton and electrons to the ferrum sulfur. Okay, ferrum sulfur inside the complex 2. Now, do take note that this complex 2 does not pump does not pump proton. Okay, complex 2 does not pump proton. So let me rephrase. FADH2, okay, passes proton and electrons to the ferrum sulfur inside the complex 2. Complex 2 does not pump proton, so this results in fewer protons being pumped into the intermembrane space than occurs with NADH. And then this FADH2, right, I forgot to mention, when this FADH2 passes electrons to the FES, ferrum sulfur, inside the complex 2, right, the electrons are being passes at lower energy level. So complex 2, when this complex 2, okay, or the ferrum sulfur inside the complex 2 receive the electrons from the FADH2, what happens? This complex 2 is reduced. Then the hydrogen or protons that this complex 2 receive from the FADH2 will diffuses into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria from the complex 2. Next, the ferrum sulfur, right, passes the electrons that it receives from the FADH2 to the ubiquinone. And what happens to the electrons in the ubiquinone? The ubiquinone will pass those electrons to the cytochrome B in the complex 3. Okay, and this complex 3 is also known as BC1 complex. Next, complex 3, right, pumps proton and passes the electrons to cytochrome C. Okay, you can see the cytochrome C here. And then complex 3 returns to its oxidized state. So meaning to say, complex 3, when complex 3 receive electrons from ubiquinone, complex 3 is reduced. And then when complex 3 passes electrons to the cytochrome C, complex 3 is oxidized. Okay, and then cytochrome C, when cytochrome C receives electrons from complex 3, cytochrome C is reduced. And when cytochrome C passes electrons to the complex 4, cytochrome C is oxidized, while complex 4 is reduced. Now, complex 4 is also known as cytochrome C oxidase complex. Okay. Next, complex 4 pumps proton and the electrons in complex 4 sorry, let me rephrase that. Complex 4 pumps the proton and the electrons in the complex 4. Remember, this complex 4 receive electrons from the cytochrome C. So what happens to the electrons, right? The electrons in this complex 4 will reduce oxygen to form water. Okay, the electron that this complex 4 received from cytochrome C will reduce oxygen to form water. Okay, so nampakah elektron ni dia akan reducekan oxygen ini to form water. Macam mana? The electrons will combine with oxygen molecules, okay, and hydrogen ions from the inner matrix to form water. So here we can conclude that oxygen is the final electron acceptor, okay, because oxygen receive the electrons from complex 4, okay, and those electrons will be reduced, the electrons will reduce the oxygen into to form water. Okay, now the last part, chemiosmosis or energy coupling mechanism. Okay, so chemiosmosis is defined as energy that is stored in the form of proton gradient across a membrane. It's used to synthesis ATP. So class, if you're wondering, okay, before we proceed with this chemiosmosis, okay, now if you are wondering how or where does the proton comes from, the ones that are being pumped by the complex 3 and 4 of the electron transport chain, those protons are from the mitochondrial matrix. Only complex 1 pumps out the proton that it received from the NADH. So NADH ini dia akan pass proton kan pergi complex 1. So complex 1 akan pump proton tu pergi inner mitochondrial membrane, okay, or inner mitochondrial space. Yang complex 3, complex 4 ini dia akan pump proton daripada mitochondrial matrix pergi ke inner membrane of the mitochondria, okay, intermembrane space of the mitochondria. Okay, now let's go back to chemiosmosis. Now this is chemiosmosis. Usually this is an ATP synthase, and usually this ATP synthase is adjacent to the electron transport chain. Okay, so now in the chemiosmosis, what happens? Okay, accumulation of protons in the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. That is very obvious, right? Because apparently these protons are being pumped into this intermembrane space by the complex 1, complex 3, complex 4. Okay, so again, let me rephrase. Accumulation of protons in the intermembrane space will create a proton gradient, okay, where proton concentration in the intermembrane space is higher than in the mitochondria matrix. So meaning to say mitochondria matrix has lower proton concentration. So bila lower proton concentration maksudnya higher pH kan. Okay, pH tu higher pH means lesser hydrogen ions. Okay, the lower the pH, the more the number of proton ataupun hydrogen ions. So this proton gradient, alright, this proton gradient, sebab sini punya concentration proton lebih tinggi daripada kawasan sini, right, which is the intermembrane space has higher concentration of proton compared with the mitochondrial matrix. So this proton gradient or protein motive force, okay, will create a potential energy that provides energy for the synthesis of ATP. So what happened? This proton, right, will diffuse from the intermembrane space of the mitochondria into the mitochondria matrix via ATP synthase. So every time this proton diffuse through this ATP synthase, what happens? Energy is provided for the ATP synthesis, where inorganic phosphate is added into ADP to form ATP. So that's how we get ATP from chemiosmosis, okay, as well as from the electron transport chain. That's why selalunya memang ya pun bukan selalunya, okay, electron transport chain dan chemiosmosis ni memang bekerja sama. Okay, so that's it for today's video. All right, the number of ATP produced in cellular respiration will be discussed in the next video.